Book I, A Marauder's Plan, Basic Pranks. Part 1, Initiating Operation Pronglet, the Lord Padfoot Prank. The 9th of June, 1994. Sirius landed by the ruin of the Potter's home in Gardrick's Hollow. He dismounted the hippogriff, fighting against the urge to get back on and continue flying. The hippogriff snorted and backed away, heading towards a nearby puddle of water for a drink. There had been no clear destination in mind when Sirius had flown away from Hogwarts, but something had pulled him to the Potter's old home. The house was a crumbling wreck, shrouded in darkness. The cottage had been a wedding present from James's father to his son, an acknowledgement that unlike times of old, the newly married couple were not expected to live at Potter House with James's father, his mother having died when James was 17. Sirius could see in his mind's eye the way it had looked in its prime, the outside walls covered with ivy with the whitewashed stone peeking out in between the green periodically, the tidy front garden with its lavender and honeysuckle, the gleaming windows underlined with their boxes of flowers and herbs, Lily's pride and joy. He let out a shuddering breath, a sob catching at the back of his throat. He shouldn't have come back, Sirius thought tiredly, but where else was there to go when there was nowhere else to go but home? And the cottage with its bright blue door with the griffin knocker had once been his home as much as James's and Lily's. He had always been welcome there, had lived there for a time while he recovered from tangling with Death Eaters and almost dying. Of course when James had lost his father, he'd moved himself, Lily and Harry to Potter House, but they had soon moved back when they'd needed to go into hiding. Sirius closed his eyes against the wave of memories, the bright sunny rooms, Harry in his crib gurgling with laughter, James grinning about some prank, Lily teasing them both with a glint in her eye. He rubbed at his forehead. It felt like years of fog were beginning to clear. 12 years in Azkaban had left its mark, Sirius determined, that and his own blind rage at Peter. And that had started right where he was standing. The memory of that night cut through his mind, sharp images of loss, the overwhelming panic when he'd realized Peter was missing, the shock of grief and terror at the sight of the house, and James dead, James, his best friend. The grief sent him to his knees again just as it had on that terrible night. Then, there had been Hagrid with Harry and orders to take Sirius's godson to Dumbledore and Lily's sister, Petunia. In hindsight, Sirius should have gone with him and told Dumbledore about Peter. He shouldn't have let Harry out of his sight. But he truly believed Harry would be safe with Dumbledore, and he had been fiercely pleased that it left him free to go after Peter. He'd been so stupid. He opened his eyes and took in the sight of the battered house again. I screwed up, James. I suggested Peter as secret keeper and he knew I'd come after him for betraying you. He was ready for me. He shook his head. He could remember the confrontation as though it had happened the day before, the cold of the air, the smell of rain, Peter's smug expression as he'd made his accusation and the heat of the explosion. He'd been blown backwards, landing in a heap, blood pouring from a wound on his head. Had he actually been concussed? His thoughts had been cloudy and muddled, all over the place. He couldn't remember much of anything either, couldn't remember his trial had there actually been a trial. Couldn't remember anything except waking up days, weeks, maybe months later in Azkaban with no way of contacting anyone who might have helped him. He'd taken refuge in the knowledge that he was innocent and the small comfort that Harry was safe. And he'd lost track of time after that until the minister had stopped by and actually given him a newspaper. After that, his only thought had been to protect Harry from Peter. Sirius paused for breath, realizing belatedly that he'd continued talking out loud. Talking to yourself first sign of madness, isn't that what you always told me, James? He said softly. He sighed and stared blankly at the ruined house. He could feel the urge to leave nudging at him again, to get back on Buckbeak and head for somewhere warm and sunny where he could recover from Azkaban. But that would mean leaving Harry. Harry's living with your sister, Lily, Sirius said. I went to see him there when I got out of prison. It had been the first thing he'd done. He'd wanted to check on his godson before heading north to wait for Peter at Hogwarts. Seeing Harry running away had changed his plans. He's not happy. I mean, he's brilliant, James, really brilliant. He saved my life. But he's too thin and small. He wanted to come and live with me straight away. Who wants to live with someone they don't know unless they hate where they are? I think your sister and her family treat him badly, Lily. I need to get him away from them. Of course, I can't until I'm cleared and no longer on the run, and that's not likely to happen anytime soon. He got to his feet, crossed his arms over his chest and pushed the urge to leave away again. He frowned, his brow lowering as he mulled over the issue. The problem is that, as much as I hate to admit it, I've been acting too much like a Gryffindor, Sirius said with a huff of exasperation. I went running off after Peter when you died, and this year all I've done is try and get to Peter again even if it was so he wouldn't hurt Harry. And I failed both times. He sighed heavily. If I want to protect to Harry properly, I need to start thinking and stop reacting. The niggle at the back of his mind to leave Britain, to leave Harry, shivered and disappeared abruptly. He'd shaken off a compulsion spell, Sirius realized. Probably Dumbledore. The old coot had no doubt thought compelling Sirius to get as far as possible was for his own good so he wouldn't get caught by the Ministry. Or maybe so that he wouldn't stay too close to Harry. That thought arrested him for a long moment. He shook himself as though he was Padfoot, trying to dislodge the idea. But he had promised to start thinking and so he did, pacing back and forth to give in to his need for movement. Why would Dumbledore want Sirius to stay away from Harry? Okay, Sirius could acknowledge that he needed to heal from the effects of Azkaban and that there could be reasonable doubts about his ability to care for a young teen. But, Sirius was Harry's godfather. He could understand Dumbledore taking baby Harry with Lily's sister in the immediate aftermath of James's and Lily's death, had even reluctantly agreed with the plan by handing over Harry to Hagrid. In fact, very few people had known where Lily's sister resided in the Muggle world and Sirius knew Lily had placed wards around the place. He could also understand why Dumbledore had left him there once Sirius was imprisoned and Harry's godmother, Alice Longbottom, had been attacked. There was an automatic belief that blood relations were best and maybe Dumbledore had assumed that Petunia was the named guardian for Harry. Sirius couldn't remember if Dumbledore had ever seen the Potter's Will. Dumbledore probably had little knowledge of how much Petunia disliked magic, and even if he had, he'd possibly made the assumption that Petunia would care for Harry regardless because he was family. Still, Sirius mused thoughtfully, it didn't excuse Dumbledore for seemingly missing all the signs of an abused child when Harry had gotten to Hogwarts or, worse, disregarding them and leaving Harry with the Dursleys anyway. He stopped pacing. Why would Dumbledore have disregarded signs of abuse? No. Sirius couldn't believe that. He could believe that abuse had been missed hadn't his own abuse at the hands of his dear mother been overlooked until he'd run away from home. But he couldn't quite dismiss his underlying notion that Dumbledore wanted distance between Sirius and his godson. Possibly Dumbledore thought Harry's Muggle relatives provided a safer environment than Sirius, and okay, it wasn't as though Sirius could provide a home while he was on the run. Or Dumbledore might just not trust Sirius. Which sounded more likely because Dumbledore had always had trouble seeing beyond the black name Sirius carried. Wasn't that why he hadn't even rated a visit from the leader of the Order of the Phoenix after being imprisoned? Everybody got a second chance with Dumbledore except for Sirius, it seemed. Sirius wondered if Dumbledore would have stood by and let him be kissed. Certainly it seemed like the kids had gained some kind of approval from the headmaster to save him, but just why was it that the kids had needed to save him? Why couldn't Dumbledore guarantee him a fair trial? Wasn't he the chief warlock? Sirius was aware that the old wizard didn't like to wield the power the wizarding world had given him too often, but he had power. Power was something that the House of Potter and the House of Black had once enjoyed, magical power aplenty certainly, but both families had also built financial and political alliances. And it was that kind of power that Sirius truly needed if he was going to protect Harry, from the Death Eaters, from Peter, from the possibility of Voldemort rising again. It was that kind of power which would get Sirius what he wanted from the Ministry, namely his name cleared and guardianship of Harry so he could ensure his godson had everything he needed: love, happiness, fun, security. And he evidently needed that same power to ensure that Albus Dumbledore couldn't stop Sirius from being with Harry, if that was Dumbledore's plan. Sirius looked up at the night sky and shook his head in denial of where his thoughts were leading him. A rush of wind touched him and he breathed in the scent of lilies. At least he knew he had her approval. You always said that you would do anything to keep Harry safe, Lilyflower. I always said I would do the same, but I didn't get it until now that anything means anything. Another breeze brushed over him. It felt comforting and familiar, affection, safety and family all tangled together in a way that spoke of love. Sirius closed his eyes again, grief rocking through him. James. He gave a short, humorless laugh. You shouldn't approve too soon, James, because you're not going to like my plan. Merlin knows I don't like my plan. But if it was power Sirius needed, he looked back at the house and whistled for Buckbeak. It was time to retreat to the one place Sirius had never called home. They landed in the back garden of 12 Grimald Place. Everything was overgrown and unkempt, a wild tangle of tall grass, weeds and flowers that had escaped their beds and meandered all over the once pristine lawn. The old trees that bordered the property created dark imposing shapes in the night. The protective statues were pale lumps of marble. They didn't wake with his arrival, and Sirius breathed out in relief. The house was under a death fidelius. He'd known that being a black was enough to see the house, but he'd been unsure that the actual wards around the property would accept him. He had been an outcast because of his allegiance to the light to the Potters, and had been worried that there might have been something to keep him out specifically. He threw a look at the neighboring houses. He knew the spells disguising the garden and house would mean muggles and other wizards would skip over number 12 and see the next house along. You can stay in the garden, Buckbeak, or go on your way, he said fondly. You've saved my life and I thank you. Buckbeak bowed low and Sirius did the same. The hippogriff turned and launched itself back into the air, a couple of sweeps of its powerful wings later and it was out of sight. Safe travels, my friend, Sirius murmured in the darkness. He made his way to the house, taking the side path to the steps down to the back door that led into the basement, the old merchant's entrance. The narrow black door opened on his approach. It looked as though the wards had granted him more than simply access, they were inviting him in. Sirius took a deep breath and entered his childhood home. The smell of dank mold and decay hit his nostrils immediately and he cursed his sensitive padfoot nose. He wished he had a wand to dispel the stench. He stepped into the small receiving area for tradesmen and the door closed behind him, locking him in. The gaslight flickered on recognizing his presence. Sirius ignored the doors to his left which would lead to a potions lab, a cell that he would rather avoid, and a staircase down to a cellar. He headed up the staircase to his right instead and came out in the long narrow kitchen. The room was filthy with dust and dirt. He grimaced and hoped the rest of the house wasn't in a similar state. He'd been informed of his mother's and grandfather's death by the warden, so for the house to be deserted and empty wasn't a surprise. He'd just expected the old house elf, creature, would have kept up maintenance. Maybe the elf had died. Or his mother had killed him. He wouldn't put it past the balmy old bitch. He opened up the door that led to the reception hall. You. His mother's voice had him snapping around in shock, his heart pounding. A portrait glared back at him in the half-light coming through the window above the front door. A familiar pop signaled the arrival of the missing elf. The aged being took in Sirius with a glare. You is not welcome here, master. Master. Sirius smiled at the elf's unwilling confirmation of what Sirius had hoped, that with the passing of his grandfather, it was Sirius who was the recognized heir and head of house. My house, creature, he stated firmly. You can stay and obey me or you can have clothes. Creature will stay despite the traitor to his mistress who is now his master. Sirius let one eyebrow creep up in his forehead and the elf shuffled his feet and pulled at his ears, punishing himself automatically for his disparaging remark. You will refer to me as Lord Black. You will not tell anyone of my location ever. You will obey only me and you will inform no one of my secrets. You will speak to no one without my express permission. Is that clear? Creature obeys Lord Black. He's not Lord yet. His mother sniffed in her portrait. The rings are in the vaults. I hardly think you, a convicted criminal, will be able to get to them. At least, you redeemed yourself at the end. Sirius stared at her. I hate to disappoint you, mother, but I didn't actually betray the Potters or kill those muggles. He paused. Actually, that's a lie because I love to disappoint you and would love to continue doing so. Unfortunately, I have recently realized that I have to restore the standing of the ancient and noble House of Black so I can take over the wizarding world, thus ensuring my guardianship of my godson. So apparently you're going to get some of what you've always wanted. His mother's portrait stared back at him, speechless. Yes, Sirius agreed, understandingly. I was shocked and horrified myself. Creature's ears perked up and he straightened with a gleam in his oversized eyes. You intend to restore the standing of the ancient and noble House of Black? I do, and as my mother well knows, I can perform the inheritance ritual here. He pointed at the elf. This place is a mess and not in keeping with either our wealth or reputation. You will immediately begin cleaning and redecorating it, starting with the master bedroom and bathroom for my use. Dark artifacts are to be placed in a trunk for my inspection. Neutral colors will be used and you will avoid the depressing gothic horrors of my mother's tastes. I will be in the study. Creature snapped his fingers and popped off before Sirius could say anything more. Sirius gave a heavy sigh and turned to his right. He avoided the staircase leading up to the bedrooms, catching a glimpse of a wall decorated with the heads of house elves. They hadn't been there when he'd run away. His mother must have gone completely insane in her final years, he mused. The door to his right would lead to the formal dining room, the informal living room and the summer room overlooking the garden. He barely glanced at the doors to his left, the reception room with its public flue, and the formal parlor instead. He took the door at the end of the corridor. It opened up into a cozy library. The main library was at the country estate, but Sirius couldn't remember its location because of the death Fidelius. The knowledge would return to him when he had completed his inheritance ritual. He bypassed the shelves of books, noting he'd have to go through them and put the more dangerous away. The door to the study was to the right and he entered the room with trepidation. For a moment, he stood just inside the doorway. Creature must have raced to get to the room because it was devoid of the dust and decay in the rest of the house, even though the decor remained tired and familiar, the ornate wallpaper peeling at the edges. There was a roaring fire, casting warmth across the room, and the lamps had been lit. There was also a tea tray loaded with sandwiches and cake that Sirius hoped Creature had conjured and not made given the state of the kitchen. Sirius breathed in the scent of the old leather chairs, the faint lingering scent of the tobacco his father had preferred. He remembered only too well the last time he'd been in the room. It had been the summer after his 5th year and his father had asked him bluntly what his allegiances were. Sirius had told him that he would never bow down to Voldemort, that he would never take the Dark Mark, that he would stand beside the House of Potter in the war. His father had been surprisingly civil and agreeable. He had even suggested having someone on the other side of the war would help reduce the risk that the house would be decimated after all. If the light won, then hopefully Sirius would be alive to continue the line. Sirius had politely agreed and privately thought he would never be the head of house despite his father spending years grooming him to be just that, that he would never want to be the head of house. The irony was bitter to swallow, Sirius thought with dry amusement. Old history, Sirius told himself briskly. He might never have intended returning, but he was there for Harry. He just had to remember that, and all else was tolerable. He sat down in his father's chair, his chair. He ate one of the waiting sandwiches as he reached down and rummaged in the top right drawer. He drew out a selection of wands, his father's, his mother's and his great-grandfather's. He tested each as he finished the makeshift meal and drank the accompanying juice and water. He settled on his great-grandfather's wand of oak with a core of dragon scale. It was an acceptable match and would suffice until his name was cleared and he could replace it. Sirius pulled out a small ritual bowl and dagger from the bottom drawer. Familius Magicus. He tapped the bowl with his wand, making the inside cloud up with swirling silver sparkles of magic. He slashed his palm without ceremony and let the blood drip into the bowl. I, Sirius Orion Black, claim by blood, by law, by magic, the House of Black. I swear to lead it with honor and fairness, to protect and shelter those who belong or ally to the House of Black by blood, by law, by magic, by oath, to deliver justice on those who break oath and trust with the House of Black. So have I sworn, so mote it be. The magic surged out of the bowl and surrounded him, a bright cascading stream of silver that blanketed his core and tested his worthiness. He could barely breathe under the power of it, magic steeped in blood and ritual, magic as black as his name. But he refused to bow to it. He was a black and the magic was his to command, not the other way around. The magic left abruptly and settled before him in the cloudy shape of the house totem, a silver-hooded snake. It bowed to him solemnly and disappeared. It had worked. Sirius let out a shaky breath and pushed his hand through his wild hair. The strands tangled unexpectedly with a ring on his finger and he drew his hand down to stare at the lordship ring, a black onyx stone stamped with a silver snake set in a platinum band. The ring had been called to his finger with the ritual. He'd worn the matching earring once upon a time, and as his eyes fell to the desk he saw it sitting in the bowl. He gave a sigh, picked up the earring and secured it in the wooden box on his father's desk where the ring had traditionally been kept. A tap of his wand had the box locked and only he would be able to open it. He got up and turned to the fireplace with its surround and mantel of stone. In the center of the mantelpiece the black crest was carved in wondrous detail, it was also the keystone for the wards. Sirius pressed his still-blooded left palm onto it. He felt the wards shift to his control. "Fidelius," Sirius said firmly. He felt the wards respond and knew his location was hidden completely with satisfaction. "I, Sirius Orion Black, am named Secret Keeper." He focused again and shut down the flues with a thought. The portraits were put to sleep to prevent them from spying. He sat back down, exhausted. There wasn't much time left before the end of school and there were 100 things he had to do in order to ensure Harry would be away from the Dursleys sooner rather than later, but in truth all he wanted at that moment was a bed. Creature popped in beside him. He held out a folded piece of parchment and another ornate box. He looked nervous. "Young Master Regulus ordered Creature to give these to you, but Mistress punished Creature when Creature told her of young Master Regulus's death and ordered him to stay in the house." Sirius took them with a frown. "Lord Black's bedroom and bathroom are ready when you wish to retire." Creature popped away again. Sirius looked down at the box and parchment. He sighed and set the box on the desk, opening the parchment. "Dear brother, I regret many things, but mostly I regret listening to our mother and not following your path. I broke faith in the House of Black by taking the mark of Voldemort, someone who I have realized is totally without honor, someone who would prefer to rule us all. He kills without regard for blood or for allegiance. I have seen pure-blood wizards in his service fall at his hand, and I have seen enough of the horrors he perpetrates to know I regret my decision to follow him. I write this with the knowledge that I go to betray him tonight. It is this mission I must tell you about. He created Horcruxes. He has used items of great value to do so, believing they will not be destroyed. He gave Hufflepuff's cup to Bella for safekeeping, a diary or journal of some sort to Lucius, and the location of Slytherin's locket to me. I do not believe these are the only ones. He prefers 7 as a number in rituals, so with the assumption the 7th fragment remains in his mortal body or on the mortal plane, there will be 3 others. He spoke of an old head of house ring which I fear may be a 4th, and I believe another item of Ravenclaws resides at Hogwarts, but as he only made an allusion, I could be wrong. That leaves 1 unaccounted for, brother. I know you have problems with basic arithmetic. These abominations will need to be destroyed before he can be defeated outright. Tonight, I will retrieve the locket. I hope I return and tell you about this letter in person when I present the locket and my knowledge to you and ask for protection. If I don't return, Creature has orders to give this and hopefully the locket to you. I hope it helps the light. More importantly, I hope it helps you. I have not been the best brother, Sirius, but I go tonight hoping to restore my honor and do you proud. Regulus. The letter crumpled in his hand. Sirius closed his eyes, remembering his brother. Sirius had protected him from their mother all their childhood, but the year Sirius had gone to Hogwarts had been enough for her to turn Regulus against him. He sighed deeply, swamped with his own regret that Regulus hadn't lived to tell him in person that he'd seen the light literally. But, bloody hell, Horcruxes. That was how Voldemort would rise again. And when he did, he'd come after Harry. Sirius was certain of it. It was just too much to think about after the day and night he'd had finally having a chance to talk with Harry, facing Peter, reconciling with Moony, having to charge down Moony to save the kids, having Harry save him from the Dementors, having Harry save him from being kissed, escaping, claiming the House of Black and setting the Fidelius charm. Tomorrow, he'd deal with it tomorrow, Sirius decided, locking up the box Creature had left, the one which presumably contained the locket with its fragment of Voldemort's soul in the desk. He went in search of his bed. Chapter Warning of Mention of Abuse. 3 days after his flight from Hogwarts, Sirius walked into the newly decorated and gleaming dining room for breakfast and immediately spotted the eye-catching phoenix perched on the back of his chair. A more nondescript brown owl he'd had Creature by and whom he'd named Hooter, was also waiting for him and eyeing the phoenix as suspiciously as Sirius. The owl ward he'd reinforced would have turned away all but his own owls and Harry's Hedwig. He hadn't counted on meddling firebirds. He'd sent charmed notes to Harry and Remus the previous evening saying nothing but variations of that he was safe somewhere sunny and that he would stay in touch. He didn't want Dumbledore to think he was still in Britain or alerted in any way to what Sirius had planned. Because Sirius had a plan. He had written everything on a large blackboard in the study and annotated it with sketches of Prongs and Moony. It had been a method he'd used with major pranks at school and important missions when he'd been an error. It worked well for him. He had a large tick by the first step assume the lordship of the House of Black, and had happily ticked off contact Harry and Remus before going to bed. He just hoped the rest of the plan wasn't going to come to a screaming halt with the presence of Dumbledore's familiar. "You'd better hand it over then, Fawkes," Sirius said resigned, sitting down. He savored for a moment the feel of clean clothes, Regulus's cast-offs freshly laundered by Creature, but he wasn't complaining. Against his scrubbed skin, the knowledge of his newly cut shoulder-length hair and trimmed neat beard. He looked and felt human. Fawkes dropped the parchment he was carrying into Sirius's hand and gave a reassuring trill that made him think the bird was trying to tell him not to worry. "Sirius. Thank you for the owl you sent to Harry. I've instructed him that I would reply using Fawkes in case the Ministry tries to track any correspondence." "That?" Fawkes trilled again. Sirius waved the letter at him. "Oh, I don't think he's just being careful, Fawkes. Who is he to tell my godson that he can't write to me?" He glowered. "He could have suggested that Harry write a note for you to carry." Fawkes tilted his head and bobbed it slightly as though conceding the point. Sirius read the rest of the note aloud. "It was good to hear you have found somewhere to recover from your time in Azkaban. Take all the time you need, dear boy. I would ask you not to take risks for Harry's sake. He would be most upset if you were to be captured. Be assured that I will see to Harry's safety in your absence." He scowled. "Love and kisses, Albus." He glowered at Fawkes, who had drilled back at him admonishingly. "Okay, so he didn't send me love and kisses, but, Fawkes, this is full of doublespeak and you know it." He gestured with the letter again. "What he's actually saying is, stay away from Harry. You and I both know it." He sighed. "Do you think that's what Harry wants?" Of course he had no true idea about what Harry would want. He hoped Harry's delight at the idea of living him had been real. Fawkes tilted his head and flew back to Sirius and nudged Sirius's chest with his head. Warmth filled Sirius, comforting him. Harry did want him in his life. The memory of Harry's smile when Sirius had made his offer for the teen to live with him filled his mind. Sirius breathed out and stroked Fawkes' plumage. "Thank you for the reassurance, Fawkes. I needed that." His eyes narrowed on the bird. "You agree with me, don't you? That Harry would be better away from the Muggles?" Fawkes cooed brightly. "So, you won't be telling your nosy old wizard where I am?" Sirius started to smile as Fawkes bobbed his head in agreement. "Thank you," he said. He'd still look into adding a Phoenix Ward though, maybe one that would allow Fawkes but banish any wizard he might be unexpectedly transporting. The Phoenix sent him another admonishing look as though he'd read Sirius's mind and took flight. He disappeared in a show of flames. Hooter gave a squawk, reminding Sirius he was waiting. Sirius handed over some bacon as an apology and took the letter. It was blank. Sirius grinned and tapped it with his wand. "I solemnly swear I am up to no good. Padfoot. I'm glad you're safe. I've returned to my home near Oxford as I resigned from Hogwarts. Snape managed to let slip about my furry problem and, well, we both know what would happen, so I left before Albus was placed in the unfortunate position of having to fire me. Truthfully, it is probably for the best. I was careless after all on the full moon, and I almost ended up hurting the children. It's certainly my fault that Peter got free. My only regret is that I won't be able to spend more time with Harry, but I'm reminded that it's a selfish desire when I think of all the time I've already spent with him and that you have been denied." Sirius snorted. He couldn't deny he'd felt jealous at the idea of Moony spending time with Harry, but he'd been relieved that at least Harry had Moony. Only he didn't anymore. "Stupid Snivellus," he muttered under his breath. "Talking of Harry, there are things I need to tell you. I know it's probably for the best that you don't tell anyone where you are, but, well, I've missed you, my friend, and I think our discussion will need to be face to face. Send word when you think it's safe for us to meet." Take care, Mooney. Sirius felt his emotions surge and took a deep breath. He'd restarted his occlumency training the night before in order to regain some control of his mind and his emotional state. His thoughts were too inclined to drift, his moods to swing. He had to get some control over himself if he was going to look after Harry. Creature popped up beside him. Do you wish something different for breakfast, Lord Black? What? Sirius stared down at his uneaten food. No, I just hadn't started eating. Creature placed a nutrient potion beside the plate and disappeared. Sirius scrunched his face up in disgust but drank down the potion. He needed it and the food he tucked into with gusto. The kitchen had been returned to immaculate condition and he was enjoying Creature's cooking. In fact, the whole first floor of the house had been renovated since Sirius's arrival. Old decor and furnishings had been thrown out and replaced or revamped. Warm neutral colors of browns, creams and gold pervaded. Red had been used as an accent, including the study where the walls had been painted a warm maroon color. Landscape paintings had remained but all others had been placed in storage in the attic, including that of Finer's Nigellus Black. As a former headmaster of Hogwarts, the portrait could have spied on him for Dumbledore, and despite Creature stating that Finer's hadn't visited his portrait in Black Manor for years, Sirius wasn't taking any chances. His mother's sleeping portrait had been given to Creature as a reward, house elf magic unsticking the damn thing from the wall. He had no intention of ever wakening her portrait ever again nor seeking her advice. Even if he could use someone other than Creature to talk to about his plan. His eyes fell on Remus's letter. Mooney. Of course, he could ask Mooney to come and stay with him to help him. It was perfect. Remus would have a job and Sirius would have to be very careful about how he offered it or Mooney's pride would get in the way of him taking it. He finished his breakfast and sent a note to Remus with the second owl he'd purchased, a black majestic and distinctive-looking bird bought for when he needed to send mail as Lord Black. He'd named it Reg in honor of his late brother. The note invited Remus for an interview that afternoon to be the steward of an ancient house that had just been claimed. Sirius had included details of the salary, duties and benefits and the address. If Remus was interested, the letter would act as a portkey delivering him to his interview. If he wished to decline, he could do so by reply. Sirius hoped Remus would accept. He had questions for his friend about Harry, about what had happened in the intervening years when Sirius had been in Azkaban. And he'd missed him too. The next few hours were torture. He had to distract himself with helping Creature cleanse the basement of dark magic. Sirius had no use for a potions lab or a torture cell, and they were turning the area instead into a combination gymnasium and dueling room. He needed to get his fitness back. But not before too long. Remus's scheduled arrival time was upon him and Sirius made his way to the reception room. He'd swung from optimistic hope that Remus would accept his invitation to pessimistic certainty that he wouldn't, despite Reg returning without a reply. Remus arrived on time, landing with ease. His face broke into a wide smile at the sight of Sirius and he dived across the room to sweep him into a hard hug. Padfoot. I thought it might be you. Remus pulled back and grinned at him. Mooney. Sirius couldn't stop smiling. He hugged Remus again and let him go before he embarrassed himself and burst into tears of relief. Well, as much as I'm sad there isn't a job, I'm delighted to see you. Remus said happily. I can't believe you stayed in England. I have plans, Sirius said tentatively, and I'm afraid the job offer is real, Mooney. He gestured vaguely to the newly painted crest on the wall as though to point it out to Remus. I might have claimed the lordship of the House of Black. Remus goggled at him. Come with me and I'll explain everything. Sirius said, pulling Remus out of the room and to the study. Oh. Sirius leaned back in his chair and twirled his wand thoughtfully as Remus stared at the blackboard and then back at Dumbledore's letter on the desk in front of them. He'd been doing the same thing for 5 minutes and Sirius couldn't quite stop himself from thinking it wasn't a good sign. Remus sighed and took a fortifying sip of tea. Well, I can understand why you've gone this route, Padfoot. He tapped the ceramic mug he held. Despite my own debt to Albus, I've spent most of this last year alternating between wanting to thank Albus for the opportunity to finally get to know Harry and wanting to hex him for keeping me out of his life to date. How did that happen? Asked Sirius, curious to know what had occurred. His friend grimaced but met his gaze. As soon as I got the news, I came back from Romania just in time to attend the small funeral for James and Lily at Gardrick's Hollow. He forestalled Sirius's question by raising a hand and answering it. Potter House, including the family cemetery there, must have gone immediately under a death Fidelius, and obviously its location would have only been known to someone in the House of Potter. Like Sirius, who had been granted sanctuary in the House of Potter. I and the Longbottoms accosted Albus after the funeral, both about you and about Harry. He shook his head at the memories. I wanted to visit both of you so I could hex you into a million pieces, and Harry so I could confirm he was safe and well. Albus informed me that you had already been sentenced to Azkaban. Sirius waved away the information. What about Harry? Well, Albus confirmed that he had taken Harry to Lily's sister in the Muggle world and she had assumed guardianship, that it was a done deal. Alice was furious, but Albus pointed out you were in prison. They had been under Fidelius and he had no idea who their secret keeper was. Anyway, Frank said that was fine, but now that they were out of hiding, they would take guardianship of Harry as James and Lily had wanted. And then they got attacked. Sirius murmured, trying to piece together the disparate information he'd managed to gather the previous year. Actually, they were attacked 2 weeks later. Rumors sighed heavily. In that interim period, the ministry demanded proof to overturn the guardianship of a blood relative. Well, the Longbottoms didn't have a copy of the will. The Potters' solicitors Arkham and Arkham claimed theirs had gone missing. He took a breath. I searched through your stuff at your old place since I had a key, but couldn't find a copy there either. Gringotts claimed they couldn't open the Potter vaults without a Potter to retrieve the original. My copy of the will is in my vault. Sirius said quietly. Of course it is, Rumors said. I surmised as much at the time. He paused. Frank and I had just agreed that the only thing for it was for him to negotiate with your grandfather to claim the vault under the House of Black and provide them with the will if it was there, but before he could, like you said, he and Alice were attacked. Sirius shook his head, thinking how everything had conspired to go horribly wrong for Harry's guardianship after the death of his parents. Anyway, with the Longbottoms incapacitated and Augusta dealing with one traumatized baby, the whole thing was dropped. I know James and Lily had probably made provisions for if both you and Alice were unavailable, and I toyed with asking your grandfather, but knew that unlike the Longbottoms I had no political leverage to get him to give me the will, and I didn't want to give him the idea of, well, making a claim for Harry himself. Sirius nodded slowly. Wise. He would have done it. And you remember James and I used to joke that we were cousins. The relationship is a few times removed, but your grandfather would have run with it, and with you named as guardian in the will, it would have strengthened his claim. Rumors took another sip of his drink. I dropped the idea of guardianship and went back to Albus to request access. Which he refused. Sirius determined harshly. Said the wards had been set to deter dark creatures, and regardless he had promised that interaction with the wizarding world would be minimal until Harry was old enough to attend Hogwarts. And by minimal, Albus presumably meant to say non-existent. Sirius said caustically, already upset on Rumus's behalf for the dark creature comment. I argued with him that he couldn't leave Harry there without any oversight at all. He argued that with the wards he would know if Harry was attacked by Death Eaters. I argued that it wasn't good enough. He eventually conceded that perhaps someone placed locally to observe was a good idea. Rumus's gaze darkened. Then he argued that it couldn't be me, as a young man interested in a small child would be suspected as a pedophile. Sirius growled. Rumus's expression cleared and he gave an appreciative smile. I know, Padfoot. I was upset too. But I had to concede the point. My interest in Harry would have been deemed unusual. At least you got him to put someone in to check on him. Vic, right. The batty old woman who used to come to the order meetings stinking of needles. I saw her when I went there after I escaped. Sirius felt his anger at Dumbledore stir again, felt his certainty that Harry wasn't safe at the Muggles grow. I never knew who it was. Rumus took a calming breath. After my confrontation with Albus, I was still determined to find some way of being in Harry's life, but unfortunately a couple of days later my father had a stroke and was hospitalized. My next few months were filled with trying to look after him, and my mother, who was distraught. He died early the next year, and my mother a few weeks later, from a broken heart, I think. I'm sorry, Rumus. Sirius said softly. He'd liked Rumus's parents, they had been good people. Rumus nodded an acknowledgement. I was a mess. I'd lost too much of my pack all at once. By the time I came out of the depression, Harry was 6 years old. But you tried to see him. Sirius said firmly. Both of you, actually. Rumus smiled at Sirius's surprise. The mind healer said it would be useful to lay my ghosts to rest, and I had so many questions, Padfoot, about why you'd done it. It didn't make any sense to me. I was very confused. Sirius sighed at another lost opportunity for him to have seen someone, to have told his story sooner. I'm guessing you didn't get permission. While I'd been wallowing in grief, there had been a backlash against werewolves, including a new restriction that stated that we were not permitted to visit inmates of Azkaban. Rumus shrugged. I decided I had to leave you in the past, and I'm sorry about that. Sirius waved away the apology. And Harry? I decided to ask Petunia directly and managed to track her down through Muggle means. I sent her a Muggle letter reminding her that I was a friend of Lily's, and requesting to see Harry as he was of school age and possibly was curious about his parents. I offered to help her explain magic and the wizarding world to him. He harumphed. She actually did write back very politely, telling me essentially to sod off. Harry was a normal child and he was going to a normal school, and any questions he had about his parents she would answer. Normal? Sirius repeated. Harry turned my hair pink at 3 months. I know. Rumus sipped his tea. I was concerned and wrote to Albus, leaving out that I had already approached Petunia. I asked for an update on Harry and requested again to see him. Albus told you everything was hunky-dory. That was the gist. Rumus gave a pained smile. He reminded me he had promised Petunia minimal interaction until Harry went to Hogwarts. He suggested that it was not wise for me to dwell on the past and to focus on the present. He was certain I would be reunited with Harry in good time. Sirius snorted. I know, Rumus agreed mildly. I had started to conclude that Albus had no intention of letting me near Harry. Well, on bad days when I couldn't find work or got heckled for being a werewolf it was me in particular, and on good days it was anyone. You didn't give up. Sirius stated with a knowing smile. I did for a while, Rumus conceded. I had to go abroad for work, but I wrote to Albus in the June before Harry turned 11. I offered to take him his Hogwarts letter, explain everything and take him shopping in Diagon Alley. He took another sip of his tea. Again, he refused. Only Hogwarts staff could inform students. I found out who he did send this year while I was teaching there. You know who Albus got to do it? Sirius shook his head. He hoped it hadn't been Snape. Hagrid. Hagrid. Sirius repeated numbly. He loved Hagrid, he did, but if he was asked to choose someone to send to introduce a child to the wizarding world, Hagrid would not have been on his list of candidates. Even Snape would have been better. And Harry would have needed a proper introduction by the sound of it. Like I said, hexing Albus has been on my list of things to do this year. Rumus put the mug down finally. I wrote back to Albus once Harry began school suggesting perhaps I could begin a correspondence with Harry. Again, the answer was no. Harry was just adjusting to his life in the wizarding world and his unique history. I tried writing to Harry directly anyway, and the owl returned just as it always did. Of course, half our world probably tried writing to him in his first year. Sirius frowned, concerned. It made sense for Harry to have had an owl refusal ward placed on him, but clearly exceptions could be made since Sirius's mail had made it to Harry. Then out of the blue, Hagrid wrote to me. He was hoping to put together a photo album of James and Lily for Harry. Rumus gestured. I went through my albums and what I had taken from your place and sent them to him. I asked him to let Harry know I would be more than happy to spend time talking Harry through the pictures. Hagrid sent a thank you but nothing more. Rumus rubbed his forehead. So, once again, I waited until school started and wrote to Albus requesting politely to allow my owl through to Harry. You are nothing if not persistent, Moony. Sirius commented dryly. Others would have given up. I had nothing to lose, Rumus responded, and I was hoping Albus had run out of excuses. But Albus hadn't run out of excuses. Rumus said dryly. It was another please be patient reply. I probably would have pushed it, but I lost my job a week or so later and had to go back to France for work. Sirius wondered if that had been Dumbledore's doing, but he shook the thought away. Surely, even the old man wouldn't have gone to those lengths to deny Remus a place in Harry's life. Remus smiled, and it was not a happy smile but rather a predatory one. And then you escaped from Azkaban. And suddenly Albus needed you. Sirius concluded. He had suspected from his sneaky observations of Harry over the previous months as Padfoot that Remus hadn't been part of Harry's life prior to the school year, but he had hoped. Well, that explains a lot. Oh, it doesn't stop there, Remus said. As soon as he made his offer of employment, Albus said I must promise to let Harry come to me first and not to say anything about his parents until he asked, that it could be upsetting for Harry for me to bring up the topic. Sirius lurched to his feet, too upset to sit still. You didn't promise, did you? Remus held up a hand. I promised, with no real intention of keeping it. Once a marauder. He let his voice trail away, but Sirius got the message. Remus had intended to find some way of circumventing Albus's wishes. But then I met Harry and I couldn't bring myself to tell him. What? Sirius snapped. I pretty much froze. Remus flushed with embarrassment. I'd been fighting so hard to see Harry that I lost sight of the fact that he wouldn't be the same cheeky chap who called me Mooey and demanded cuddles as soon as I walked in the door. Instead there was this quiet, intense 13-year-old boy who didn't know me from Merlin, and I hadn't considered until I actually saw him, what if he doesn't like me? What if he finds out about my furry problem and... He stopped abruptly. Sirius paused in his pacing and threw himself into the second visitor's chair opposite Remus. He could understand Remus's position. He'd had his own moments of disorientation with Harry, of trying to reconcile the happy baby he'd loved so unconditionally with the teenage boy he was watching over, had talked to so very briefly, a teenage boy he didn't actually know and who didn't know him. So you waited? Remus nodded unhappily. I realized that I should have just told him as soon as I introduced myself, and bugger my lack of courage and Albus's well-intentioned concern. He sighed. Because that's the thing, Padfoot, on the face of it, all of Albus's actions look like well-intentioned concern and a desire to protect Harry, especially when you consider Harry's role as the boy who lived. He paused again. Taken individually, none of Albus's actions are sinister. He circumvented the system and the will. Sirius pointed out. Yes, but did he know for certain the contents of the will? Do you remember if he was a witness? Remus responded. Sirius shook his head. He couldn't remember who had been the signed witnesses with any clarity. And, without the will, taking Harry to Petunia was probably what the Wizarding Orphan Office would have done anyway. Remus continued. Petunia is Harry's closest living family. Add to that Harry was probably safer in the Muggle world from the Death Eaters looking for revenge at the time, and I'm sure Albus keeping everybody else away from Harry was also meant to ensure that safety. He gave a small shrug. And, from some comments Albus let slip, I think he hoped Harry would have a normal upbringing since our world had already given itself over to the boy who lived madness. Exactly how did that get started? Sirius asked. Nobody really knows what happened beyond the bare facts, and probably a combination of Hagrid and Peter. Remus interrupted. Hagrid was never the most discreet of the Order, and I rather suspect Peter, or rather Wormtail, was there that night. I think he saw what happened and told the tale to whoever he could as soon as he could to ensure attention was on Harry and away from himself. Damn it! Sirius snapped. If he was there when I was there, then he knew you would be searching for him. Remus smiled sadly. It explains why he managed to get the better of you. Sirius pushed the thought away and refocused on Harry. Okay, he said slowly, so we provisionally accept that Dumbledore placed Harry with the best of intentions. When he'd considered the matter alone, he'd reached that conclusion, but it was somewhat comforting to know Remus was in agreement. But it doesn't explain why he's missed the abuse since. Remus interrupted. Sirius stilled. You know that for certain. I ended up spending a great deal of time overseeing detentions for the Weasley twins, Fred and George. Remus began. Minerva kept giving them to me as revenge for our school days, I think, and... What does this? You remember Ron is Harry's best friend. Remus interrupted. The twins are in Gryffindor and on the Quidditch team with Harry. They are very fond of him, consider him an honorary Weasley. Sirius's confusion dissipated. Remus folded his hands over his stomach. Last week, at the beginning of their detention, I made a comment that I was worried about the home life of a friend of theirs, and while I didn't want to put them in the position of breaking confidences, I would appreciate any information they could give me. He sighed. They immediately knew it was Harry and were very reluctant to talk, but once they began, they couldn't stop. Sirius finished. Remus's eyes flashed angrily. The summer after his first year, they found him locked in his room and barely fed. They recovered his trunk from a locked cupboard under the stairs which had an old picture taped up saying Harry's room. They said that they didn't think Harry had received Christmas or birthday presents. They know his Muggle clothes are hand-me-downs. The rest, well, it's all speculative. Sirius grabbed the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white. When I resigned, I tried to talk to Albus about what the twins had told me and he didn't seem at all surprised. Remus said in a calm tone that belied the furious light in his eyes. He claimed that while yes, Harry's relatives didn't provide the best care, the Dursleys continued to be the safest place for Harry. In my opinion, he's being willfully blind not only to the mistreatment, but to the effect such mistreatment has on a child. Sirius raised his eyebrows at the very evident snarl in the words. Maybe we should drop this. Neither of us can afford to go after Muggles or Dumbledore with murder in mind. We're going to get Harry away from them, I swear. His friend stared at him for a long moment, but the heat in his eyes faded. I never thought I'd see the day Sirius Black advocated caution. Harry, Sirius said firmly, is more important than anything. I've learned my lesson. Well said, Sirius. Remus reached over and patted his arm proudly. He hesitated momentarily until Sirius made a get-on-with-it gesture. I'm just wondering if you want me to tell you about Harry's first 2 years at Hogwarts. Of course. I want to know all about Harry. Sirius responded immediately. Why would Remus be so hesitant? He froze. Did something happen? Remus sighed heavily. I'm afraid you're not going to like this. Remember, said Remus, once he'd gotten Sirius to calm down enough to continue, I got most of this from the twins and some follow-up conversations with my fellow professors. You'd better just tell me. Sirius said. It can't be much worse than what I'm imagining. Remus smirked. In Harry's first year, Albus hired Voldemort to teach defense of the dark arts. Sirius's mouth dropped open. He snapped it shut. He did what? To be fair to Albus, he hired a man called Quirrell. Voldemort just happened to be possessing him. And Dumbledore didn't know? Sirius asked, shocked. Creature popped in and delivered a tray with a bottle of fire whiskey and 2 tumblers. He disappeared again. Remus poured Sirius a drink and handed it to him before he poured himself one and retook his seat. We'll come back to that excellent question later, but let me explain properly. Sirius nodded reluctantly. The first story the twins told me was actually about Harry getting on the Quidditch team. Apparently, in their first flying lesson, Malfoy stole something of Neville Longbottom's and took off with it when Hooch was absent. Harry went after Malfoy and when he tossed the item, Harry caught it. Harry has a very low tolerance for bullying. His old friend gave Sirius a pointed look and Sirius had the grace to blush. I wouldn't call what we did bullying, it was pranking. Sirius muttered defensively. Pranking the whole school into being green for a day wasn't bullying, Remus agreed, arguably, hexing Severus constantly just because he and Lily were friends and she wouldn't give James the time of day until our 6th year crossed the line. And I would very much advise that you confess to Harry. He'll respect you more for owning up than insisting that what you did wasn't bullying. Sirius nodded slowly, although he chafed at both the criticism and the advice. So, I saw Harry playing Quidditch, he said, changing the subject rather than arguing. He is brilliant. Remus's expression softened. He is, isn't he? And apparently Harry almost falling off his broom is a tradition. In his first game, Quirrell, or rather Voldemort, jinxed his broom trying to kill him. Harry had almost been killed by Voldemort in his first year. Sirius downed the fire whiskey and coughed violently when it hit the back of his throat. Hermione Granger thought it was Severus and set fire to his robes. Sirius almost choked on the laugh that bubbled up. If he hadn't already liked the young witch who had helped Harry save him, that piece of news certainly would have done the trick. And in doing so inadvertently stopped Kirill Voldemort. Remus gulped down his fire whiskey. The twins then told me it wasn't the only time Harry tangled with him. Sirius reached over and poured them both another drink. For the record, this is worse than I was imagining. Well, the second tale is worse than the first and it isn't even the last. Remus said, rubbing his forehead tiredly. Apparently, Hagrid got a dragon egg and it hatched. Harry and his friends got Charlie Weasley who works at a dragon reserve to come and take the dragon in a midnight smuggling expedition. Unfortunately, they got discovered, lost a tremendous number of house points and had to serve detention. Minerva gave the detention to Filch who got convinced by Hagrid to give it to him. No doubt it was Hagrid's way of trying to say sorry for getting them into trouble. Sirius waited for Remus to continue impatiently. He took them into the Forbidden Forest ostensibly to search for an injured unicorn. Harry came across the wraith of Voldemort drinking unicorn blood, and ultimately had to be rescued by a centaur. Remus said. Sirius carefully downed his second drink. Well, at least we know he's actually still out there. Voldemort, I mean. Remus grimaced. That's not the end of it, Sirius. Harry and his friends worked out that Albus had hidden Flamel's infamous Philosopher's Stone in the school and that Voldemort would be after it to get immortality. When they realized Dumbledore was off the grounds at the Ministry, they went to check on Albus's protections, realized they had been breached and went after the potential thief. Don't tell me. Sirius slumped back and closed his eyes. He was getting a headache. Harry and his friends got past all of the so-called traps and Harry stopped him. The twins didn't know how Harry stopped him because apparently Harry has never talked about it and Hermione had stayed back to look after an injured Ron. What they do know is that at the end of it, Kirill was gone dead. I suspect given the possession and Harry, he was in the infirmary for days. Sirius opened his eyes to see Remus downing his drink. So, to recap, my godson goes to Hogwarts, supposedly the safest wizarding place in Britain, and survives 3 encounters with Voldemort in 1 year. Not to mention, Albus bloody hiring Voldemort and hiding an artifact in the school that was bound to attract him. Remus added tersely. It was a good point. It led to other good points such as whether Albus Dumbledore had lost the plot entirely. You'd better tell me about Harry's second year before I decide to just down the whole bottle. Sirius said, topping them back up. Remus sighed heavily. Well, firstly, I believe it relates to one of the items on your blackboard. He pointed his wand at the section entitled Horcrux Hunt and Destroy, and put a strike through one item. Harry has already dealt with the diary. Almost an hour later, Sirius finished listening to Remus telling the tale of Harry's rescue of Ginny Weasley and shook his head in disbelief. He took one deep breath after another trying to get hold of his whirling emotions. His godson had almost died again. Are you okay, Padfoot? Remus asked. Sirius saw that he was regarding him with wary concern. He gestured vaguely at his friend. I'm just trying not to freak out. Remus completed. I think I hyperventilated for a good 10 minutes. About which bit? Sirius asked tersely. The bit where Harry is a Parselmouth like Voldemort? Or the bit where the whole school turns on him? Although in the abstract the twins' dubbing of Harry as a Dark Lord was slightly humorous. Or the bit where he almost gets eaten by Acromantula. Or the bit where he almost gets eaten by a bloody great basilisk, saving some idiotic girl who should know better than to write in a diary that talks back to you. Oh, and let's not forget battling with the sole remnant of old Voldemort himself. Again. He was yelling by the end of it. Remus looked at him with raised eyebrows. Sirius took a deep breath and rubbed a hand over his eyes. Sorry, Remus. It's just. No, your reaction pretty much mirrored mine after the twins finished telling me. Remus said with a smile. I did however miss out the idiotic girl section since the idiotic girl in question was a Weasley. You always were the diplomat in the group. Sirius said, letting some of his anger drain away, the rest he refocused. I can't believe Dumbledore wasn't aware of what was going on. Ah, yes. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Remus said thoughtfully. After all, as soon as Fred, or was it George, anyway as soon as one of them mentioned petrification, I immediately began thinking. What creatures can petrify another living being? Sirius nodded briskly. The same thought had occurred to him during Rumus's retelling. Not to mention that Slytherin is associated with a snake mascot, and since it was clear that the monster was hidden in Slytherin's Chamber of Secrets. Rumus sighed. I got Basilisk before the twins got to the spider's bit. Well, you were also the most intelligent of us in the old days, Moony. Sirius joked. Rumus smiled again, and they shared a moment of camaraderie tinged with the sadness for all they had lost. Anyway, Rumus cleared his throat. I did question Minerva and Pomona after my session with the twins, wanting to know why they hadn't discovered it was a basilisk earlier. Albus had told the staff apparently to focus on the students and their classes, that he had an investigation well in hand. Sirius lurched out of his chair. They believed him and made no effort to investigate on their own. Rumus frowned. I don't believe Albus knew exactly where the chamber was or how to get into it, but I do think he knew that the monster was a basilisk and that Voldemort must have possessed someone in his school again in order for the chamber to be opened. In some respects, I think Albus was truly doing his best to solve the problem, although I abhor his decision to continue as normal, putting the students' lives at risk. So, do I think he set up another showdown between Voldemort and Harry? No. Sirius stopped pacing and faced Rumus, realizing what he had implied. You think he deliberately set up the showdowns in Harry's first year? Rumus picked up his discarded fire whiskey and sipped it. I've had more time to think about this than you, Padfoot. Sirius looked at Rumus and recognized the look on his face all too well. I'm not going to like this either, am I? No, Rumus said bluntly. Perhaps you should sit. Sirius glared at Rumus but sat down again. Imagine for a moment that you're Albus. You know the common story of the boy who lived, told to every child, that Voldemort attacked the Potters, James and Lily died but Harry didn't, that somehow the killing curse rebounded off Harry and killed Voldemort. You believe the story to be mostly true, but you don't know for certain how Harry survived the killing curse, although you have theories, and you don't know for certain that Voldemort is dead, although again you have theories. And if you have theories, you have to test them. Sirius mused. Exactly. Rumus pointed at Sirius. 10 points to Gryffindor. So, let's assume Albus keeps his ear to the ground and becomes convinced that Voldemort is out there in a wraith form but trying to find a body. The whole Philosopher's Stone thing was a trap to establish whether Voldemort was alive or not, wasn't it? Sirius put things together quickly. Maybe it wasn't even the real stone. I doubt it was, and I'm fairly certain the protections were more for show than anything else, since, with respect to Harry and his friends, they were first years and able to overcome them. Rumus said. No, I think Albus's plan was fairly simple, bait a trap for Voldemort and see if he showed. Only he used both the stone and Harry as bait. Sirius felt his anger stirring again. Yes, Albus used Harry as bait. Rumus agreed softly. After all, why else would he wait until Harry was at the school before setting the trap? Sirius shivered, chilled by the thought. Rumus gave a huff. I'm sure that Albus never anticipated Harry trying to protect the stone from Voldemort directly, but I think he knew that there was a possibility that Voldemort would attack Harry if there was an opportunity, and if it happened it would allow him to assess his theories about Harry. Sirius surged to his feet again. Sit, Padfoot. Rumus ordered crisply. I'm certain that Albus believed the risk was minimal. Voldemort certainly couldn't attack Harry too overtly without drawing attention, but if an encounter between them occurred. He sighed. I'm sure Albus thought in his arrogance that he had the advantage and would be there to step in before anything serious happened. And quite honestly, it isn't just Harry he risked, he placed an entire school full of children at risk with this scheme, especially when you consider that Voldemort possessed a teacher. Do you think Albus knew it was Quirrell? Sirius asked, throwing himself back in his chair. Rumus shrugged. I find it hard to believe that he didn't suspect, but I think Albus got too caught up in his grand plan. He wanted to catch Voldemort red-handed trying to get to the stone, fake or real. And because of that Harry almost ended up dead. Sirius muttered darkly. True, and it brings us on to Albus testing theories about Harry and how he survived the killing curse. Rumus said. There are 3 which I'm sure Albus has considered. 1. Harry was able to reflect the killing curse under his own power, probably accidentally in self-defense. 2. Lily did something just before she died to protect Harry. 3. It was a combination of both. I'm going to say for the record that I'm not happy Albus tested Harry. Sirius stated indignantly. He had no right. I agree, Remus said soothingly, but intellectually, I can appreciate Albus's curiosity. Aren't you curious? I'm just happy he survived, Remus. Sirius said firmly. Bollocks to how. And there speaks the Gryffindor. Remus complained. Honestly, if you can work out how Harry survived the killing curse, then what can you do with the information? Apply it to others if possible. Sirius replied promptly. Okay, I see your point. So what did Albus conclude from his testing? I don't know, Remus admitted, but personally I think Albus ruled out number 1 fairly quickly after Harry's arrival at school. Sirius frowned. Why? Harry is a powerful wizard. He was doing magic as a baby. He has a corporeal patronus at 13, Moony. Maybe, but, Dada aside, he's a solid if unremarkable student for the most part. Remus asserted. Some of that I think is the company he keeps. Ron is very average and Hermione is too good. You think he's deliberately placing himself so his friends don't get jealous? I'm not sure it's deliberate per se, but yes. I would also say, having worked one-to-one with him, that some of his power might be suppressed. Remus sighed. Probably because of the Muggles. If he learned as a child that magic was bad and doing odd things was bad, then. Sirius waved a hand to indicate he'd gotten the point. So, you think Albus took a look at his grades and ruled out Harry himself as being the cause of his survival? You think Albus decided Lily had done something? I do. Remus coughed and looked slightly abashed. And I know she did. You know how? What? What did she do? Sirius demanded, leaning forward. I don't know exactly, Remus qualified, but she wrote to me just before I left for my last mission, asking my advice on something she had found in an old runes book covering witch magic. It was a protection spell. It required the blood of the child and the blood of the mother to arm, and the mother's sacrifice of her own life in protection of the child to activate. It creates, for want of a better explanation, a protective blood ward around the child attached to its very skin. The one who killed the mother would never be able to touch the child without penalty. Sirius stared at Remus shocked. Merlin, Remus, that sounds like borderline dark magic. That's what I wrote back to her. I told her it wasn't illegal as it wasn't on the list of banned magic, but it wouldn't go down well if she used her own child's blood in a spell outside of familial magic. Remus rubbed a hand through his hair. There were specific conditions that had to be met regarding the sacrifice too. In particular, the attacker had to kill her in order to specifically get to the child. It was a long shot. Lily wrote back telling me that she would do everything she could to protect Harry. That was the last letter I received from her. Wait, Sirius said, you said that the attacker Voldemort would have to kill her because she needed to be removed to get to Harry specifically. Remus's eyes widened, realizing the implication immediately. You think, well, it makes sense if the spell worked, but Voldemort was after Harry. Did they ever tell you why they went into hiding, Moony? Sirius asked. James just told me that Dumbledore had received some information and they thought it was a good idea. They told me the same thing, but... Remus tapped his fingers on the arm of the chair. The Longbottoms went into hiding at the same time, didn't they? Because of the same intelligence. Neville was born around the same time as Harry, but why would Voldemort target the children unless... He stopped abruptly, as the pieces of the puzzle slid together suddenly. What if there was a bloody prophecy? I know who could probably answer that. Sirius said dryly. Not that he will. No, if Albus thought there was a prophecy, he'd keep it close to his vest. Remus growled angrily. Creature popped back in with a tray of food for dinner and they both fell silent, lost in their own thoughts as they focused on the meal. Okay, Sirius said, pushing his plate away and reaching for the pumpkin juice, so let's recap what we know. Remus nodded. James and Lily went into hiding because of information that Albus provided to them. We assume this is a prophecy, probably concerning Harry. He pointed his wand at the plan on the blackboard and added an item check with the dom whether a prophecy for Harry is registered. Peter rats them out and Voldemort tries to kill. Sirius swallowed against the hard lump in his throat, tries to kill Harry, but Lily protects him with this old blood protection spell. Voldemort is defeated but not killed. I don't think it was the blood protection alone, Remus corrected. I think the curse hit the ward, and while it couldn't stop it, it slowed it down enough that it gave Harry time to reflect it back at Voldemort. The scar is where the curse effectively came into contact with the protection, otherwise it shouldn't have left a mark. I thought you said Dumbledore ruled out Harry's power as a cause. Sirius asked, confused. I'm sure Albus did, Remus stressed. I, on the other hand, take into account that Harry showed signs of being a very powerful wizard before that moment, and I take into account that he's likely repressed his power since in order to live with the Muggles without further incurring their wrath. Of the three theories on why Harry survived the killing curse, I plumbed for the last, that a combination of Lily and Harry enabled it. Well, I would never bet against you, so. Sirius waved his hand majestically at Remus. Moving on, I stupidly give up Harry to Hagrid, get framed by the rat and hoisted off to Azkaban. And Albus places Harry with his aunt, his closest living relative. Remus shuddered. And the closest blood relative. Sirius added thoughtfully. You know Lily placed blood wards on her sister's Muggle house, said after the attack on her parents that she wasn't taking any chances with what little family she had left, whether her sister wanted the protection or not. Really? Remus blinked. You're thinking something which is usually not a good thing. He prompted when Sirius remained silent. What if Dumbledore examined Harry and realized there was a protection based on blood surrounding him and got the wrong idea? Sirius posited. What if he assumed the blood wards around Petunia's house had been placed there for Harry in case something happened to Lily? An extension of the protection she'd already placed on him. Magically it would work, Remus said, turning over the idea in his head. Lily's blood in both wards, both protective in nature, possibly Harry residing within the house enabled the blood ward around it to be maintained, otherwise it would have needed Lily renewing the protection every year. It's entirely possible that the Dursley house is the safest place for Harry from a magical perspective. Well, bugger that. Sirius said forcefully. It obviously isn't the safest place for Harry from every other perspective. Agreed, Remus said. He narrowed his eyes as Sirius pointed his wand at the blackboard. Review wards appeared. Sirius got to his feet, restless again. Where were we on our recap? Albus placed Harry with Petunia. And left him in exile in the Muggle world for 10 long years. Sirius shook his head. I don't think I'm going to forgive him for that. I'm not sure I'm in a mood to forgive him either. Remus muttered. He pushed himself out of the chair and walked over to the blackboard. Harry turns 11, gets his Hogwarts letter, and Hagrid reintroduces him to the wizarding world. Badly. Quite. Remus said. He added a section to the plan entitled Education and wrote another item to the growing list, Teach Harry wizarding culture, etiquette and his heritage. He cleared his throat. Harry goes to Hogwarts, where Albus tests him to find out more about how Harry survived the killing curse and wrongly assumes it is down to Lily's protection rather than any outstanding ability on Harry's part. Another item appeared under Protecting Harry, research Lily's spell. Harry defeats Voldemort again, Sirius added, and Dumbledore gets his proof that Voldemort is alive in some form. He walked up and tapped the Horcrux section. And we know why. Although probably at that point in the timeline, Albus doesn't, as there are a number of dark rituals that could have anchored Voldemort to this plane. Remus murmured. No, Albus doesn't find out until Harry's second year when Harry destroys the diary Horcrux. He sighed. It's possible Albus is out searching for others. Sirius shrugged. If he is, he's not made much progress. I have the benefit of Reg's note, so have an idea of the number. I have the locket Horcrux and can get my hands on the cup one if I seize the Lestrange vault. We'll need help to find out how to dispose of them and track down the 3 missing ones, but I'll be damned if I'm going to Dumbledore. You don't know how to dispose of them. I know how to create a Horcrux. That was part of the advanced section in Dark Arts my father made me learn, but disposing of them, no. I guess I can ask Harry how he did it. The Unspeakables might know. Remus offered. You have Conquer the Ministry under your Take Over the World section. It wouldn't hurt to use them, nor the DMLE come to that. They should be informed that Voldemort is still a viable threat, and I suspect Albus hasn't said anything to them. Let's come back to that. Sirius said briskly, twirling his wand. Okay, so after Harry's second year, Albus knows how Voldemort stayed alive-ish. Then I realize Peter is at Hogwarts and, well, we know what happened next. I ended up having to be rescued by Harry and escaping on a hippogriff. Remus patted his shoulder. But you've stayed serious. You haven't allowed Albus to run you off again. He pointed at the blackboard. This needs some work, but it's a solid plan to get Harry away from the Dursleys and try to protect him in the future. He turned to his friend, determination shining in his eyes. I'm not going to let Albus run me off either. Whatever you need, Padfoot, I'm in.